Thank you very much, Horst, for those very, very kind words, even exposing my embarrassment when I finished my thesis at MIT, trying to put together a paper in macro, a paper in bargaining, a paper in IO, and I don't know what together, and find a title for all that. And I think many of us have the same dilemma. That's part of the evolution of our professions. But this was very kind, and I must say I'm very honored to be among you today to give the Manchot-Lecture. Thanks so much for your kind invitation. So I'll be discussing, and thanks so much for coming, all of you. I mean, this is a very impressive crowd. So I'm going to discuss a number of policy issues and talk at a very general level. And of course, tomorrow I will be focusing on more precise models of a few of those things, not all of them, of course, because the crisis is so complicated. It's very hard to redevelop a model that encompasses all the aspects of it. The current crisis is quite different from the Great Depression for many reasons, including our understanding of economic crisis, which hopefully has improved, and I think has improved, but it's no secret that it raises a lot of concern. The recession, we don't know how long it's going to last, but it's going to be serious, more serious than a standard credit crunch. And there are long-term consequences, wealth effects, which are substantial, including for countries. And one of the big worries nowadays is of course, what's going to become to our currencies and public debt, and how much inflation, everybody talks about deflation, but how much inflation will follow in order to repudiate the debt. Sums which have been committed, maybe not lost, of course, but committed until now are quite substantial. I mean, just if you take the US, 50% of GDP are committed within a year before the forthcoming stimulus. That's a lot of money. And we have to ask, there are really three topics. The first is, how did this come about? Subprime losses are sizable, but there is a sense in which they are small. If you take the IMF estimate of October, I believe, $1,000 billion, I mean, this is not much. It's 4% of the New York Stock Exchange valuation in 2006. It's very often that the stock price goes down, the stock index goes down by much more than that without any economic consequence. I will argue that there's been a massive failure of financial regulation. And the second topic is crisis management. What should we do now? And I'm not going to talk about that very much. We could discuss that during the questions. It's a very difficult issue. I think what I would like to spend more time on is what should we do so that this doesn't happen again. So it's very linked. 1 and 3 are, of course, closely linked. If we have to establish a diagnosis in order to formulate some reform proposals. So what I'm going to do is basically start with this, with this number 1, which is, where's the pointer? Yeah. How did this come about? What happened? And I'm going to give you 8 reasons for that, 8 factors that combined together made it into a very bad thing. Most of those factors will be very familiar to you. I mean, it's in the newspapers every day. I want to give you some economic angle, and that will prepare you. Anyway, we have to remember those factors before we move on to topic 3, which is what I would suggest for reforms. So let's start with number 1, what happened? And people say usually there's been a lot of liquidity earlier in the years 2000 in the US for 2 reasons. The first, of course, is that Greenspan really want to have low rates of interest. His monetary policy was very lenient with low rates of interest, short-term and long-term, for a long time. And then on top of that, you had excess savings coming from sovereign funds and China and so on. And they were searching for source of value. You have savings, you cannot put them in China because there are no developed financial markets. You put them somewhere, and they put those savings into the US. So there was a lot of cash floating around in the US, which had some consequences, including, oops, just got it wrong, large lending capacity, so there was, for the US financial system, a large capacity to lend, and which had two consequences. The first is that when you have more money to lend, you go somewhere else. So you go to new loans, and those are usually the loans that you will not grant normally, so they are riskier loans. And the other aspect is that on the loans that you will have granted anyway, the inframarginal loans, there is more competition, and that has resulted in an erosion of margins on that thing. So you could not use that as a cushion for the risky loans. Those subprime loans, you all know, I mean, from the newspapers, they are loans with very low or no equity. So basically, you can bring 5% of the value of the house, and you borrow, you get a mortgage for that. With teaser rates, so those are rates which go over time. So there are very low rates of interest that you have to repay for 2 years, and then high rates of interest. And also adjustable rate mortgages. So basically, they are indexed to the interest rate in the market. So that implies, and I will come back to that, that if the rate of interest in the market goes up, then you have to repay, instead of repaying $500, you have to repay $700 or $800, and then you may be in trouble. No documentation, so you don't check what the person is declaring in terms of income and so on. So those are all kinds of risky loans, and there's nothing very new there, except the responsibility of the administration and Congress. I think the US authorities have a big responsibility in what happened, and it's easy to blame the financial system, and the financial system, of course, is to blame. But that's going to be a common theme of my lecture, is that let's stop blaming the financial system. Of course, some people who are not very scrupulous basically took advantage of all the loopholes and so on. But it's really the public sector which is also to blame. And the US administration in particular. The generous interest rate deductibility is an old thing. It has always existed. But then the low interest rates, which facilitate purchase of housing, for example, are also to blame. Fannie and Freddie, which is going to cost at least $200 million will not be much, billion dollars to the US taxpayer, were basically private entities with the backing of the US government, and they were pushed in exchange of this backing to make certain types of loans. Prudential regulation that we'll discuss later on, which also favor this kind of activity, and weak consumer protection in the sense that, in my view, we should have warned those households of the dangers that they were facing. Some of them knew quite well, and they basically did that very strategically. They took mortgages very strategically. Some others just didn't know. And I think we should have helped them understand the risks they were facing. When interest rates move up, and remember that when interest rates move up, but borrowers are in trouble, the ones which have adjustable rate mortgages may not be able to reimburse because their income is not sufficient. Furthermore, the real estate prices are likely to stagnate or fall. And then the borrowers cannot refinance, so they cannot take a new loan against the value of their house, or they may tragically default. So, if you have a mortgage of $100,000 and the value of your house is $80,000 or $90,000, what's your best strategy? Well, just default, right? And I want to insist on the fact those are not just wealth redistribution. And wealth redistribution may have some indirect effect, but they have no direct effect on the economy. Here you have direct economic losses because when you have a mortgage which defaults, there are administrative costs, vacancy, deterioration, unpaid taxes, agency fees, and so on, plus a loss of value, which is a redistribution, but that loss of value was, of course, borne by the banks, and that has some implications we'll be talking about later on. Third factor, excess securitization. The foundation for securitization, or the bright side of securitization, is the following. Take a bank, we need cash. So the bank needs to invest in new project, or maybe it has incurred some losses, and it needs more money. And it owns a loan portfolio. So we talk a lot about real estate in the media, but of course, it's also credit cards, student and car loans, and so on. So it's sitting on this illiquid loan portfolio, and it needs cash. What can it do? Well, it can resell part of this loan portfolio to other entities in order to get liquidity and be able to reinvest in new projects or to cover the losses. It's a useful institution. There's a bright side to it. The standard argument is the one I just gave, which is enables refinancing by the bank. It transforms illiquid book into a liquid one. Sometimes, in some situation, it may help the bank diversify. And then there is another aspect to it, is that it creates stores of value for the economy, which are very valuable. And remember what I told you about the sovereign funds and the Chinese and so on, trying to look for store of values. Well, once you securitize those loans, they become market instruments, and investors can come and buy those stores of value. And if there's a high demand for that, that means you'll be able to sell them at a high price. Nothing wrong with that. It has been existing for decades, probably centuries. And this is a useful institution. The problem with that institution is that it was used in the wrong way. There was excess securitization. And it's pretty clear, and I'm not going to teach you anything here, that when you resell 80% of your loans, you have much less incentive to take care of their issuance to see if the borrowers are good borrowers. And notice in particular that for those subprime loans, only 46% were, a fraction 46%. You also have to see what exactly was resold. But let's simplify. A fraction 46% of the loans was basically securitized in 2001. In 2006, 81%. Okay, so basically, instead of keeping 60% on your books, you keep only 20%. And that has deep incentive effect because basically, your incentive is reduced. It's only 1/3 of what it used to be. It's enormous, and people start collecting evidence of this moral hazard. This paper, which is there, actually looks at two samples of mortgages, and they are exactly the same according to scoring rules, except that for some legal reason, one is eligible for securitization, the other one is harder. And they look, lo and behold, the mortgage default is plus 20% if you're eligible for securitization, when it's very easy to securitize. It's clear evidence of moral hazard. Basically, it could be a bit of adverse selection as well, but whatever, the point is that the loans which are securitized to a large extent are going to be bad loans. Now, in principle, whether you can securitize or not depends very much on also if people look at the quality of what you securitize. After all, it doesn't matter if you securitize 80% of your loans if the people on the other side, the buyers, look at it. Okay? So we have to ask ourselves, why is that the banks who bought those loan portfolios or those structured products, why didn't they look at it? Somehow there must have been an incentive prime. The other person who looks at it normally is the rating agencies. The rating agencies, when you securitize, are supposed to take a picture of the value of the things you securitize, and that's part of the certification process. It's just like an IPO for venture capital for a startup. Here it's exactly the same on the debt side instead of the equity side. Basically, you securitize your loan. At that point of time, the rating agency takes a picture and says, this is good stuff. It's AAA. Or this is bad stuff. It's lower grade. Now, one of the issues, of course, is that the rating agencies didn't do their job in the process. So there were two issues with that. So we start from a moral hazard prime, which comes from high degree of securitization. And on top of that, the rating agencies don't do their job and the buyers don't look. That's recipe for disaster, of course. Let me not get into, you probably have to write in the media, and to simplify a lot, you have those structured products. So the bank basically brings together set of assets, creates an asset portfolio that it's going to securitize, and it's going to cut, it's going to form an entity and it's going to cut into pieces with a senior tranche being, in principle, relatively safe, something like AAA, and then a mezzanine tranche, and then equity tranche, which is supposed to be very risky. And by the way, this is not a bad idea. I mean, this is actually a good idea because you have some institutions who want a senior tranche. They want something which is relatively safe, and you have some other institution, they may be very happy with something which is very risky, so you basically talk to different risk attitudes, and there is nothing wrong with that. So that brings me to the next point, which is the lax supervision by the rating agencies. They are the bad guys, that's for sure, not the only ones. The rating agencies, as you know, is basically a duopoly or a triopoly, and there are interesting issues about why this is the case. Basically, you have two big rating agencies in the world, very concentrated. There were a bunch of conflicts of interest, including in the way they were compensated. And something which is also well known is that there was a lack of transparency for several reasons. First, those rating agencies started offering new services. So, for example, you could go to them and you could say, I'm thinking about offering this portfolio in the market. Can you give me some consulting advice as to whether it's going to be rated highly? I'm not asking you to rate it, but just tell me in advance whether you're likely to give a good rating. And then of course, if you think you're going to get a bad rating, you don't apply anymore. You just withdraw. The other thing is that there are other types of consulting services. So you could also ask the rating agencies to tell you, can you tell me how I just get AAA for that? The minimum good stuff I can put in it so that I get AAA, a good rating. And just that, without any corruption, without any wrong incentive, just that changes things. Because that means that the AAA is not a standard AAA. Because you just compute so that you get just beyond the post. So you just make it to AAA. So that means that the AAA were all marginals at best. Instead of being an average AAA, they just get above the threshold. So the tranches were marginal rather than average. So just that will say that even in the absence of wrong incentive and so on, you already have a prime. A AAA is not a AAA. Okay. Fourth point is, and then we'll put that at the end altogether, but this is a generalist transformation. So basically, an entire economy taking gambles on the yield curve and being highly leveraged. And I will come back to that, and I will write down a formal model of that tomorrow and try to explain how this comes about. So and I apologize to all of you who know the asset liability and all the details of the accounting of financial institutions. Let me just simplify enormously and take a financial institution which has some assets. And then on the liability side, if it's a commercial bank, it may have some retail deposits, so the money that you and I put in our banks. If you are an investment bank, you don't have retail deposits. Then you have short-term wholesale deposits on the money market and other markets. Then you have long-term debt and hybrids, the preferred stocks. And then you get into the equity tranche, which is basically share issues and the retained earnings. Just to simplify, and you forget about the capital under Basel I, but just basically you have, that's if you are regulated. And if you have retail deposits, usually you'll be regulated. And if you don't have retail deposits, most often you are not. Now, what I want to argue, which is not, it's not new, of course, but I want to stress this point because it is very important. Short-term debt, by short-term debt, I mean those short-term wholesale deposits, not so much retail deposits, which are more stable because they are protected by deposit insurance. But the short-term wholesale deposits makes you very fragile. They make you very fragile because if the interest rates go up, then you are in big trouble. The thing is that when the interest rate were 1%, that means, and you roll over, so you borrow overnight or you borrow 3 months. And then you roll this over. So that means that your cost of capital is 1%. It's very, very small. It's incredibly profitable. But if the interest rate goes back to 5 or 6%, you're in big trouble because that means your cost of capital will go up a lot. And that creates some fragility, all the more that there may be doubts about your solvency. If you have very little capital, and those banks lately have been running with clearly not enough capital, then if on top of your other difficulties, you have your cost of capital, which goes up in terms of the short-term wholesale deposit price, the interest rate going up, then you are in trouble. And we have seen some of that, of course. We haven't seen the increase in the interest rate, and I'm going to come back to that. But we certainly have seen the doubts about the solvency and the flight to quality, where investors just want to put their money with treasury bonds and don't want to have anything to do with banks or firms for that matter. Let me drive the point home. When you have a financing need, you need cash. What do? The first thing is, I just mentioned, is that you use what's called the funding liquidity. So you basically raise money on the liability side. That's one thing. The other approach is that you can deleverage. You can deliver, or I don't know what it's called, but you can reduce your leverage. And for that, you use what's called funding liquidity, not market liquidity. I'm sorry, it's a typo. You can use funding liquidity on the asset side. So what you can do is to take some of those assets, just like real estate assets or even stock market assets if you want, and you sell them in the market. So you shrink the balance sheet size. That's one thing, and those two are actually quite correlated because if you have those assets, okay, and you want to resell them, you have to resell them to someone. And if the other banks or the other financial institutions have no cash at that point of time, and they have no funding liquidity, so they cannot borrow more, then of course you are not going to sell them at a very high price. So there's actually a fair amount of correlation between the funding liquidity and the I'm sorry, what did I say? Yeah, the funding liquidity and the market liquidity. I think that's correct. So basically, if you want to sell assets and get cash by selling assets, you need people on the other side. And if the people on the other side have funding liquidity problems, then you will have trouble, and then the prices will go down. Okay? Now, lots of people, I don't know if I explain that later on, but I will explain that in much more detail tomorrow. What has happened is that lots of financial intermediaries, regulated and unregulated, have been playing this strategy. In Northern Rock is an example, for example, in the UK. They were borrowing a lot in the short-term wholesale market. But many others, investment banks, actually, we already saw that households were doing that also. The borrowers who had adjustable rate mortgages are also very exposed to increasing interest rates. LBOs, they were also very exposed. They use a lot of short-term debt. They're also very exposed to interest rate going up. And here's a key point. Here's a key point, which is the central bank dilemma. If you let the interest rate increase, as they should, then basically the whole financial system collapses because it's so fragile. It's, you raise the interest rate, the entire financial system collapses. If you keep the interest rates low, then you're basically bailing out the financial system, and you validate risk-taking, and you prepare the next crisis. Nice choice. I would not have wanted to be Ben Bernanke. I mean, this is really something I would not want the job, because either alternative is really awful. And exposed, you are basically faced with a fait accompli. what we should be doing is to avoid that this happens. Okay. So, and tomorrow I will explain how you have what's called strategic complementarity. So it's jargon to say that if you do it, I want to do it. So if basically you borrow a lot short term, I have an incentive to borrow a lot of short term. And the reason for that is through the policy reaction, which is that if all of us borrow short term, there is no other choice for the central bank but basically keeping the interest rate low. And then we are right in borrowing short term because that means the cost of capital will remain low. So that's very important. And tomorrow I will explain why you need prudential, macro-prudential regulation on this basis. 6 factors. Laxist prudential regulation. And there's been a big failure in this. Let me just say right away, being a prudential regulator is not easy. It's very hard. It's very, very technical. You have a small staff. You have around you financial institutions which have huge staff with balance sheets and off-balance sheet exposures which are incredibly complicated, with especially those derivative contracts and OTC contracts, over-the-counter contracts, which are incredibly complicated. 5 people in the world understand them. And then they have resources and they can hire the best people. It's just very hard. And you're just sitting there and you're supposed to regulate those mega banks and those mega insurance companies, those pension funds and whatnot. And you're there trying to understand what's going on. Knowing that the balance sheet can change overnight, it's not a great job. It's actually very interesting, but it's not an easy thing to do. But the framework was not always great. There's been a very poor measurement of risk. For example, there was insufficient capital requirement for trading for banks, and that followed some lobbying in terms of competitive level playing fields with other financial institutions. That's going to be corrected, by the way. Lenient implementation, that's the least we can say. Things were going wrong. The regulators didn't put enough pressure on banks to recapitalize or to hold more reserves. And then there is a case of investment banks. Remember, investment banks are banks which do not have retail deposits, so in principle, they are not regulated. In the US, they can be regulated on a voluntary basis. So you can go and see the Security and Exchange Commission, the SEC, and say, hey, I want to be regulated. Okay? And don't worry about that. You can go and see the SEC. You are safe. The SEC, for Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, Morgan Stanley, Lehman Brothers, and Bear Stearns, put 7 employees. I mean, if you think about the size and the number of contracts and exposures that those guys had, 7 employees is, you would have needed 7,000 employees at least. Those 7 employees, by the way, they didn't see very much, but they saw something at least. Something was wrong. And they wrote a report, and it was, this. Now, why do we care? And I will come back to that, because that's a very important thing. Investment banks, you don't have your money in the investment bank, in principle, unless you're very rich. You put your money in a retail bank, a commercial bank. So why should we care, if, after all, if the investment banks lose money? Well, we'll have to discuss that. Okay. 7-point pro-cyclicity of regulation. So the regulation actually is very pro-cyclical in the sense that it encourages economic activity when things go well, and it discourages economic activity when things go wrong. It's not per se the way it's built. I mean, if you take Basel I, which is the regulation for bank, which started in 1988, you need 8% capital requirement. So you compute the assets, you put them weights, so you have risk-weighted assets, and then you need 8% of that in terms of capital as a buffer. Fine, and 8% is not linked to the cycle. However, we have now fair value accounting. So fair value accounting means that you are supposed to record your assets at market price. Or if there is no market price, but you can rebuild one from other market prices, you do that. So basically, you try to record the maximum amount of assets at their fair value or their market value, if you want. And that's, the accountants are very much in favor of that because of its benefits. I mean, it's pretty clear that without fair value accounting, we still will not know there is a crisis, maybe. You can always delay recognition. You can always say your assets are wonderful, all those subprime assets and whatever are just wonderful things. I mean, of course, you have provision for loan losses, but if you have a nice regulator, it's not going to be a big issue. So at least fair value accounting forces you to recognize losses. And the big example, of course, is two big examples are the saving and loans in the 80s and Japan in the 90s, which were two cases where fair value accounting was not applied. And then banks could go on and do crazy things. And basically, they look healthy. Everybody knew they were in distress. But as long as you don't have recognition of the losses, that's it. But it's not neutral. Accounting is not neutral. I mean, some people, accounting is like a picture of photography, It's completely neutral. You just try to measure, but it's not neutral because you have capital adequacy requirements. So basically, imagine that on your books, you have assets like real estate, for example, and the value of real estate goes up. That means you are richer. And because you are richer, that means you need less capital. And then you can lend more, okay? So it's very pro-cyclical because if the value of the asset goes up, basically, you are richer, and then you can lend more. You can finance more economic activity. And conversely, which is happening now, when the prices of assets go down, what happens is that you have a low investment capability because you have lost money. You have to record that, and automatically you can lend less because you don't have enough capital anymore. Furthermore, you have what's called the phenomenon of fire sales, which is that if all financial intermediaries sell at the same time because they're trying to use to get liquidity from the market by selling assets, then that depresses the price of assets even more, and there is some kind of vicious cycle going on. So tomorrow we'll be discussing that also a bit because I will be talking about asset bubbles and what happens when the asset bubble bursts and what the implication could be for accounting and capital adequacy requirements. Okay, but just to tell you what has been done, what has been done is the only thing that could be done, which is awful, namely tinkering with accounting. So all at once, it's decided that fair value accounting doesn't apply anymore. So you can just say your assets are great again. It's just wonderful. And in the end, it's hard to do otherwise, but it's really bad in terms of commitment. You just have a fair value accounting system which is supposed to impose discipline on the system. And then you just, if there is a problem, you just say, oh, it doesn't apply anymore. Now, we have to find some other way. Here is something, point 8, which bothers me a lot. I mean, I'm really shocked by this. The fact that unregulated institutions they have been having a wide access to the public funds, to public finance, and indirectly to the taxpayer money. Now, this is bad. This is bad for several reasons. It's bad because it creates more hazard. It's bad because our finances are in a very bad shape in many, many countries. And if we have to cut on a number of things just because unregulated institutions have made a lot of money, have gambled, and then have asked for taxpayer money, that's really very bad. Let me give you 2 examples of that. The first is investment banks. You remember there are 5 big investment banks, and 4 of them were rescued. But Lehman Brothers was was allowed to fail. And everybody agreed that was a bad idea. And we saw what happened after the failure of Lehman Brothers. It basically made all markets illiquid. Nobody knew what was going on. It had two effects. The first is nobody knew who would be impacted by Lehman Brothers, so everybody started being distrustful of the other. And the other piece of news, of course, is that people learned that actually the other investment banks might not be rescued, which amplified the situation. So Bear Stearns was rescued directly, so taxpayer money was brought directly into Bear Stearns as an investment bank. The other three were more subtle. They changed their status. They say, oh, we no longer are investment banks. We are commercial banks. So either by buying some commercial bank or by being purchased or having some agreement with a commercial bank. So they are commercial banks. So what's wrong? You can basically bail out a commercial bank. And here you are. They were bailed out. Second example, AIG. I mean, I'm sure you all have heard about AIG, which is the biggest insurance company in the world. Will cost at least, this is an old number, actually. I don't know what it is now, but I remember a few months ago that was already $150 billion bailout, which is not bad, not bad. AIG actually as an insurance company is pretty healthy. It's actually a good insurance company. The problem with that is that AIG Insurance was just part of a holding company. And the holding company was basically an investment bank. And actually most of the activity of AIG was moved from, I mean, there was still the insurance part, but much of it had become an investment bank. Now, when AIG got into trouble, there was a big panic of the US government, and they said, we are going to rescue AIG. Now, they could have left the insurance company. Actually, by law, they could have just have rescued the insurance company, which actually didn't have to be rescued because it was healthy. What they rescued is the investment bank part, unregulated investment bank. And here you see the numbers there, okay? So basically, you have those entities which they have the cake and eat it too. They are left entirely free to do whatever they want. They can play the casino, gamble, and then, you know, they win, okay? Or if they lose, that's for the government to pay, okay? And there is something deeply wrong about this, okay? So just to remind you, there were those 8 factors. I'm sure you have others in mind. Those 8 factors, by the way, are living proof of the relevance of information theory. If you go through all of them, somewhere, directly or indirectly, there's some asymmetric information. And it's really, when you do macro nowadays, you just cannot avoid doing information economics and game theory, because at every step in the 8 things, somewhere, either in the foundations or in the actual behavior, you do have asymmetric information. And I want to emphasize this because this is not an easy thing to deal with, the asymmetric information, but we have dealt with it in the very wrong way.